Greetings all, FerrariMan601 here. Today, finally, Williams have released actual photographs of the FW40. After having given us computer-generated renditions of the car earlier this week, I decided to hold off on the podcast related to this car simply because I didn't quite trust those CGI pictures, simply because I had the suspicion that Williams were attempting to pull the wool over our eyes a little bit with regard to some technical details on the car, and of course they're trying to hide their latest developments from their rival teams. It seems that I've been proven correct because the actual pictures that we're seeing of the FW40 seem to vary significantly from what we saw in those computer-generated images. However, here we have some actual pictures of the car. Not many, I do have to warn you. We've only got 2 shots of the actual car for this video, in addition to the 2 computer images that we received earlier this week. So this video, we're going to try to get a sense of some of the development that Williams are doing for 2017, as well as compare the actual pictures to the computer-generated images, because I do want to highlight the little bits of optical trickery that Formula One teams do try to put on us, particularly at the beginning of the year. In this first shot here, this is the actual FW40. This is not the computer-generated image, and we can see it from a front-end 3/4 view. It's a little bit difficult to see some of the finer details on this shot simply because it is a black car, particularly on the bottom section with the front wing and the floor, against a dark backdrop. So some of those more intricate details here are a little bit more difficult to discern. However, we can see a few very basic highlights right here. First of all, we have the front wing following that delta profile as we are seeing on all of the cars per the regulations. Very nice shape there. Additionally, we can see a very clearly defined reference plane along the left-hand side of the car, screen right for us, and also, of course, we can see a shark fin. Now, this is the first major detail that differs on the actual car versus the computer rendering that we saw. The computerized version of the car did not feature a shark fin, very telling that Williams would try to hide that particular feature, but it's there, and pretty much all the other teams are running some variation on the shark fin or T-wing or both, like Ferrari are doing, so Williams evidently do not see a need to hide that area of development any longer. In addition to the shark fin on the rear, we can see some interesting details here. We'll start with the DRS actuator. It's a little bit difficult to see, particularly because this shot is not of the highest quality, but you can see it there in its traditional mounting place on the rear wing in the center section of the flap. Very cool. The actuator looks to be a conventional design and orientation. Additionally, on the car, we can see the front suspension now. It is a double wishbone pushrod, as we have seen on all of the other cars thus far, and of course the Haas and the Red Bull most likely will be running the double wishbone pushrod. Toro Rosso as well. I fully expect them to toe the line with that convention. Moving back toward the front wing, again, because it's black against a dark backdrop, it's very difficult to discern some finer details on this front wing, but we can clearly see very highly developed cascade elements on the sides of the wing. We have a better angle on them on the right side of the car, screen left for us, and you can see that there are many different elements playing into those cascades. I can't quite give you a number in terms of how many individual elements that we see here due to the resolution and lighting of this shot, but clearly it is a very complex solution, comparable to what we're seeing on the McLaren so far. Additionally, what this shot allows us to see is the space between the cascade element and the main wing flap itself, highlighted in this area here within the larger circle. You can see where the cascade elements and the end fence cut off and the main flap section comes back in. So the angle is not helping us here, nor is the lighting, but we can see that there are some very sophisticated geometries going on this Williams front wing. Additionally, we can see the nose. Williams, another team, definitively running the thumbnail nose, a variation of this design being employed by all teams so far except Mercedes, following a very traditional nose cone profile there, but all the other teams are using either the thumbnail or the finger nose in some variation. So not at all surprising to see Williams going in this direction. Again, it seems the prevailing thought this year is to take this airflow coming in from the front of the car and then start to route it around the car and work it toward the rear end, roughly in this profile, at least on the lower section of the car. So Williams, again, towing the line with that particular design trend. Additionally, And it's a little bit difficult to say this definitively, but I will say that there is some S-duct activity going on the front end of this Williams. Right here in the number 19 area, just above it, you can see that there is some sort of slot in the top of the chassis. And again, it's somewhat difficult to say definitively what this is, because it could be a trick of the light. Again, this shot is taken from a little bit of a distance and at low resolution, but I will say that that most likely is an S-duct. And again, the theory behind an S-duct being there will be an intake on the underside of the nose, most likely someplace around this area, and then as the air starts to come in through the front section of the car, the airflow will be picked up by that duct on the bottom and then shot through the nose at some particular angle and then exit out the top of the chassis at accelerated velocity, thus aiding in downforce generation. You can see roughly the illustration of the flow through an S-duct type device in the nose of a Formula One car. Very interesting, and it's very cool to see this feature really coming back on a lot of cars this year. Moving toward the cockpit area, everything stays pretty quiet in terms of winglet details. We can see on this area of the car here, the side of the chassis, everything is just smooth. There are no winglets to speak of here, no canard wings, no nothing. Unlike the Ferrari and the Mercedes, which had a lot of canard wing activity going on in this area of the chassis, the Williams is completely smooth. So interesting. However, we do see some very small canard wings moving toward the cockpit in this section right here. We also see some rather traditional looking vortex generators on the sides of the side pods there, just above the radiator inlets. Again, white on white. It's a little bit difficult to see with the lack of contrast, but there are at least 3 vortex generators on the top side of the side pod, just rears of the radiator inlets, as we can see. Speaking of the radiator inlets, they are somewhat small. However, given the relative size of the rest of the side pod, it does look to be appropriate. And again, Williams running those Mercedes engines, so they didn't have too many engine issues in the last couple of years with Mercedes, so I'm not expecting there to be any reliability concerns this year. Additionally, on the side pods, we can see these turning vanes, very similar to what Sauber are running in terms that they are just running straight up and down vertically. There's only one element to them, at least, that I can divine on this shot. They are connected to the top side of the side pod via this little bridge winglet here, perhaps just aiding in smoothing that airflow across the top of the side pod, running roughly in this direction, trying to get it to attach to the upper surface going downward and then starting to spill out toward the center section of the wing, just to accelerate that flow and generate a little bit more downforce. But just a little winglet there, no issue in terms of the design, rather conventional, rather conservative at this point, but let us remember this is launch spec and things can of course change. We don't have a particularly good angle of the rear end here, but there are a few more details from this shot that we're able to take a look at. We can look at the geometry of the rear suspension in this shot, and I would say that this is a pull rod rear. So just like Renault, just like Mercedes, Williams have joined the pull rod club, and again, the pull rod geometry, we're defining that as we have our suspension wishbone sections running across the top and bottom, and then you can see this silver element running, I would say, at a roughly a 45-degree angle between the upper and lower wishbones. You can see it runs in that direction there. So the idea behind this, quite simply, is to have a force exerted with the suspension loading moving upward in this direction. Thus, we have a pulling force as the wheel is loaded upward with bumps on the road. It's going to exert its force in this direction across the suspension and therefore pulling on that pull rod. It's analogous to the push rods that we see on the front suspension here, but it works in the opposite direction. So that's the rationale behind the operation of a pull rod rear suspension. I think the teams are finding that it just allows them a little bit more space to play with this suspension geometries on the rear, and also that's very critical because the airflow across the rear section is very important for aerodynamics and downforce generation, particularly with these larger diffusers that we have this year. Back in the days of exhaust-blown diffusers in 2010 and 2011, pull rod was pioneered by Red Bull for the rear suspension of their cars, and then all the other teams started to evaluate it in terms of a solution for their cars, and we're still seeing this today in 2017. Very nice touch indeed. The other detail that we can sort of make out on the rear end of the car is right in here below the shark fin. We have this little winglet area, and it's a little bit difficult to discern what exactly this is. It could just be a little duct cut into the bottom of the shark fin for some reason. It could be a fairing around the exhaust outlet. I'm not entirely sure what the exhaust configuration is going to be on this car, and unfortunately we don't have a shot of it because Williams still trying to hide some things from prying eyes, but it could also be a monkey seat of some sort, and again it's a little bit difficult to discern from this image. However, there is some activity going on with the rear end of the Williams. And on this next shot, again, this is the actual car, not the computer-generated image. We get a view from the side, looking at it straight on from 90 degrees, so a full profile view of the FW40. We can definitely see the overall profile here of the shark fin. It is a very simple design in terms of its geometry. It pretty much forms a 90-degree right angle with its rear section. It does look like it moves out a little bit beyond its top edge toward the bottom there. I'm talking about this section here. There is a slight curve in the profile here, but it's rather simplistic. It looks very similar to the design Force India are running, although I do have to say it is slightly more elegant than that. Again, this is launch spec, and all of this subject to change. We know that Williams have a very good design office, and they have some very talented engineers and aerodynamicists working for them, so I do fully expect that shark fin to go through many iterations in testing alone, never mind during the season proper. Also from this shot, we get a better sense of the turning vanes. Again, they are just very simple, straight up and down vertical strakes integrated with that 90-degree bend going into a winglet that passes just above the radiator inlets on the front side of the car, out of view on this shot. Also, we see a very typical geometry for the airbox. We don't see any splitting of the airbox, unlike what we've seen on the Sauber so far, the only car to feature a split snorkel. So Williams, again, following a very similar trajectory to Mercedes in their airbox, and because Williams and Mercedes are running essentially the same engines, you would expect a similar treatment for the engine intake aero treatment. Additionally, we can see along the floor section, just like the Renault, just like the Mercedes, and just like the Ferrari, we have some work going on the bottom section of the reference plane just before the rear tire, just above where I've drawn that line within the circle. We can see these little turning vanes, I've been calling them, these corrugations in the bodywork. They tend to run a profile sort of like this in terms of running up and down at very harsh angles, just to help deal with the airflow as it's coming in across the car, and they're trying to turn that airflow inboard toward the diffuser section and the upper side of the floor just to accelerate that flow, and then of course to get it to flow up and out of the car to generate more downforce, where of course it'll go and spin off in all sorts of turbulence and then spoil the balance of the car behind, but you do certainly get the idea. Additionally, on this shot, we can talk about the overall chassis attitude. There does appear to be a fair amount of rake running in this car. You can see the line that I'm drawing across the reference plane here is not quite straight. Therefore, the car is running in a slight nose-down attitude, and again, we call this rake, just like we did on the Ferrari. If I draw a line from roughly where I think the top surface of the T-tray is down to the ground, you will see that the line that I draw on the rear in a similar fashion is much longer from the bottom of the floor to the ground. So certainly there is a significant amount of rake on this Williams, and of course we are not surprised to see that at all. Several teams have followed this solution in terms of suspension configuration. The only other detail that we can really make out on this shot, unfortunately, because this is what we have to deal with here, we can just see the profile of those canard wings heading toward the cockpit. Again, the front section of the Williams chassis so far looking relatively simplistic, but you can just see the profile there of that canard wing. Seems to be sloping actually upward relative to the airstream, but I'm going to guess that the rationale behind this is to capture the air and then direct it this way toward the side pod and the radiator inlet. So rather than mounting the canard wing a little bit lower, say in this section, like Mercedes have certainly done, Williams have gone for a higher mounting solution and then just using a little bit of reverse psychology on the air, trying to capture the airflow this way to go down rather than trying to capture the airflow at a slightly lower angle and then either direct it up toward the side pod or continue to direct it down and then interact with the turning vanes and then go out through the back of the car in that direction. So another interesting development on the Williams. Very cool. We will see how that area of the car progresses throughout testing and of course throughout the season. Now this shot of the FW40 is one of the computer-generated images, and first of all, for CGI it looks absolutely great, but you can definitely tell that Williams were hiding quite a few details from prying eyes with these shots. First of all, if we look at the engine cover, you will notice the absence of a shark fin. Yes, there is a bit of a proto-shark fin running around in this area here following roughly this profile. However, you do not see the shark fin running out this way toward the rear wing. So Williams were hiding that as Exhibit A. Number two, what we see is if we look toward the floor, you will notice the conspicuous absence of those little striations, the turning vanes in front of the rear tire in this section here. So again, Williams just trying to hide a few things. We do see, however, on this shot, the presence of those canard wings. However, you will notice that their locations on this shot differ significantly from their locations on the actual car. On the actual car, they're about here. However, they are significantly more rearward on this shot. So, interesting little bit of theater being played by Williams. We do, however, on the computer image see the presence of those three vortex generators on top of the side pod just above the radiator inlet, and the shape and size of the radiator inlet also looks pretty much the same, as does the geometry of the turning vane here. So just a little bit of theater being played by Williams. We do see basically an identical configuration of the nose and basically an identical configuration of the front wing from what we were able to see of it from the actual shots. Again, the lighting conditions were not the best. On the actual shots as well, we could not really see the barge board detail. We can kind of see some idea of what they might be from the computer image. However, this is not to speak anything of what that configuration actually is, considering it's difficult to see on the actual shots. And of course, we know that Williams are being deceptive with these computer images. Also, interestingly enough, they did decide to show us the S-duct across the top of the chassis right here in the CGI picture, so that is certainly there for all of us to look at, and it does look pretty much identical on the actual car. The mirror placement on the cockpit, however, is a bit different. The actual mirrors are a bit higher than they are in this image. However, we do generally see the same overall location and mirror configuration. The airbox also looks pretty much identical on this image as it does on the actual car. And on this last shot, this is the other computer-generated image that Williams gave us at the beginning of the week, and we can see here a little bit more in terms of what we might be able to expect from the front wing geometries. Again, take all of this with a grain of salt simply because this is a computer-generated image, and in terms of the actual car, we can't really see this area on the front wing given the lighting and the angles that Williams have provided for us thus far. However, testing is going to be beginning at the start of next week, so certainly we will be getting better shots of this area of the car in earnest. With regard to the development of this front wing, if it is true to life, we are seeing another very complicated wing on a launch spec car. So far I am counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.5 flaps on this front wing. So if this is representative of what Williams are actually running, this is the most complex front wing that we have seen to date on a 2017 car in launch spec, so we will be watching this with bated breath. Also, in terms of the cascade elements on the wing, we can see just how complicated those geometries actually are, again, if this is actually representative of what's going on the actual car. Another detail that we can make out on this rendering, rather than on the actual pictures of the car, we have these little winglets running on either side of the brake ducts, just like we've seen on the Ferrari. Williams appear to be dealing with the attitude of the car as steering is being dialed into it, so dealing with airflow that's coming in at an angle rather than coming in from straight and level as the car is going down a straight at high speed. Very interesting development there, and again, this is probably part of the brake duct rather than a part of the actual suspension, because that starts to raise questions of legality in terms of the boxes that the FIA draw around different areas of the car just to keep things within the rules. Also on this shot, we get a better view of the nose section of the car. Again, this is CGI, however, it does seem to match up very closely with the actual photographs of the car. One more detail that we can point out and compare a little bit to the McLaren, you can see that the profile of the nostril section here is pretty much a perfect square, going straight across the top and then straight down the bottom. McLaren have a slightly more sculpted appearance to these nostrils, having a curving profile coming down on both sides really to meet up with the nose tip. However, Williams are running a very square nostril profile here. Again, these are very small details, and I don't think there's much of an aero development to be gained here with the square profile versus a sculpted one like McLaren are running, but just an interesting development there to note the difference between teams. On this shot as well, we can see that the vortex generators on the sides of the side pods are essentially identical to what we have seen on the actual photographs of the car, so no deception going on with that particular detail. Lastly, however, I would just like to point out another little design trend on the front wing that we've seen from the Mercedes and from the Ferrari, and now we seem to be seeing it on the Williams. We have two inverted U channels on the front wing. Again, Williams, Mercedes, and Ferrari, the only teams to be running those double U channels on the front wing. Again, the rationale of these just to capture the airflow as it comes into the extreme sides of the wing here, and then you want to use them basically as vortex generators, generate some low pressure so that as the flow comes in toward the front wheels, you do not have as much turbulence being generated, because the airflow going across these front wheels, it is such a huge liability in terms of drag, because first of all, you have these very large tires in terms of their cross-sectional area, but beyond that, because they're spinning, they're going to be generating an outflow that's basically going in all directions, and all of this turbulent air, it nets to a force in this direction toward the rear of the car, which we refer to as drag. So if you can minimize drag across the front end, that is just going to help your cause in pretty much all other running conditions. As far as the review of the Williams FW40, because of the limited number of images we have of it, and only two of which are of the actual car in the flesh, that's all I've got for us today. However, testing begins in earnest on Monday, and of course there will be photographers on hand to take a look at these cars as they make their on-track debut, so we are going to be awaiting that with bated breath, and any interesting developments that come out on this or any of the other 2017 Formula One cars, we will be covering them in earnest. That's it for us today in terms of the FW40. I would like to thank each and every one of you very, very much for your continued support and your continued engagement. Please continue to let me know what you think of these little tech talk sessions, as well as what you think of the 2017 cars in general. FerrariMan601 saying thank you very much for watching, and we will see you soon.